Picture this: you are standing in the largest mass grave on planet Earth. It's the spring of 1571, and you are choking on the sweet, suffocating stench of roasted human fat. Beneath your boots is not dirt, but a compacted layer of ash, crushed bone, and melted iron. This wasteland used to be Moscow. The Crimean Khanate has just swept through the city with the destructive force of a natural disaster. In a matter of hours, they burned the capital of the Russian Tsardom to the ground. You look around and see 80,000 blackened corpses choking the Moskva River, acting as a grotesque, fleshy dam that stops the water from flowing. Another 150,000 of your people have been chained together by the neck and dragged south to be sold in the slave markets of the Ottoman Empire. You are standing in the ashes of a murdered nation. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. This was not a military defeat, it was an extermination. The man responsible for this apocalypse is Devlet Giray, the Khan of Crimea, and he has tasted blood. He looked at the vast, sprawling expanse of Russia and realized it was completely hollow. The invincible Tsar Ivan the Terrible, the man who terrified his own nobility into submission, abandoned his capital and fled north the moment the Tatar cavalry appeared on the horizon. Russia is bleeding out, paralyzed by political purges, famine, and a disastrous war in the west. The state is effectively dead. All that remains is for someone to carve up the carcass. Fast forward exactly 1 year to the summer of 1572. The Khan is coming back, but this time he is not leading a raiding party to steal slaves and loot silver. He is bringing an invasion force designed to erase Russia from the map forever. He marches north with 120,000 men. This is a terrifying, multinational war machine. It includes the fastest, deadliest light cavalry on the steppe, backed by elite Ottoman janissaries carrying heavy muskets and a devastating train of modern artillery. To understand the sheer scale of this threat, you have to realize the terror of the steppe cavalry. These are men born in the saddle, capable of riding for days without sleep, sustaining themselves by opening a vein on their horse and drinking the blood. They do not march. They flow like an ocean of violence around defenses, striking with a speed that shatters the mind of a traditional soldier. The Khan is so confident in his total victory that he has already divided the Russian cities among his generals. He has already drafted the trade agreements for the new territory. He has brought civilian merchants to appraise the loot before the battles are even fought. He does not view this as a war. He views it as a simple eviction. As the earth shakes beneath the hooves of 120,000 horses, the Russian defense network collapses. The borders are shattered. The few remaining regiments of the Russian army are drastically outnumbered, starved, and terrified. They are staring down a tsunami of iron, gunpowder, and horse muscle, and there is no Tsar coming to save them. The world is about to witness the brutal execution of an empire. But in a tiny, insignificant village called Molodi, a handful of desperate men are about to dig their heels into the dirt, look the apocalypse dead in the eye, and refuse to die. It is July of 1572. The ashes of Moscow have barely washed away in the spring rains, and the nightmare is already marching back over the horizon. Devlet Giray, the Khan of Crimea, is not a man who leaves a job half-finished. A year ago, he proved that the Russian bear was toothless. Now he is returning to skin it. He has rallied a force so massive it defies medieval logistics. 120,000 men are moving north. This is not a border raid to steal cattle and peasants. This is an extinction-level event, and you need to understand what a force of this size actually looks like on the move. The Crimean Tatar cavalry makes up the terrifying core of the horde. These are men who live, sleep, and fight in the saddle. They ride with 3 remounts each, meaning a swarm of nearly 500,000 horses is tearing up the earth, creating a dust cloud that blots out the sun for miles. But this time, the Khan is not alone. He has secured the backing of the ultimate superpower of the 16th century, the Ottoman Empire. Marching alongside the steppe riders are thousands of elite janissaries. These are the feared shock troops of the Sultan, armed with heavy matchlock muskets and dragging a modern artillery train. They are bringing state-of-the-art gunpowder to a primitive knife fight. The level of arrogance radiating from the Khan is staggering, but it is entirely justified. He is so absolutely certain that the Russian state will crumble upon contact that he has stopped treating this like a military campaign. He is treating it like a real estate auction. As he rides north, he has already drawn up the paperwork dividing the Russian heartland among his generals. He has promised the city of Ryazan to one commander and the charred remains of Moscow to another. He has even brought a massive entourage of civilian merchants, slave traders, and financial appraisers following safely behind the army. They have brought empty wagons and heavy purses ready to buy the survivors and the silver before the blood even dries on the grass. The Khan does not view the Russians as an enemy army. He views them as livestock waiting to be processed, and the leadership of Russia is proving him absolutely right. Where is Ivan the Terrible in this moment of ultimate crisis? The man who famously terrorized his own population, the tyrant who founded the first secret police and drowned his own cities in blood, completely loses his nerve. The moment his scouts report the size of the Tatar horde, Ivan panics. He packs his personal treasury, abandons his capital, and flees hundreds of miles north to the city of Novgorod. The Tsar of all the Russias leaves his people to be slaughtered. He effectively hands the keys of the kingdom to the Khan without swinging a sword. The path to Moscow is wide open. The horde moves relentlessly northward, a rolling wave of human misery leaving nothing but scorched earth in its wake. There is only one natural barrier left between the Khan and the total erasure of the Russian Tsardom, the Oka River. It is here that the Tatar vanguard expects to find a token resistance, maybe a few terrified peasants to trample before crossing the water and taking their new homes. Instead, they find the absolute last dregs of a shattered nation. A desperate, ragtag collection of border guards, German mercenaries, and hardened frontiersmen have dug their boots into the mud. They are not fighting for a Tsar who abandoned them. They are fighting because they have looked at the terrifying math of their own reality and accepted that the only alternative to holding this river is spending the rest of their short lives chained to an oar in an Ottoman galley. The men standing on the damp, muddy banks of the Oka River know exactly what they are. They are a speed bump. They are the sacrificial meat left on the porch to distract the wolf while the master of the house hides in the basement. Commanding this suicide mission is Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky, and if you want to understand the twisted, dark reality of 16th century Russia, you only need to look at his face. Vorotynsky is a scarred, heavily battered veteran of the southern frontier. He has spent his entire adult life bleeding in the dirt to keep the Tatar raids at bay, but his greatest threat has never been the enemy across the river. It has always been his own Tsar. Ivan the Terrible violently despises Vorotynsky. The Tsar's paranoid mind cannot handle a general who is actually competent. In the years prior, Ivan had Vorotynsky chained, tortured, and exiled, stripping him of his wealth out of sheer, unadulterated jealousy. Yet when the sky turned black with smoke and the 120,000-strong horde approached, Ivan fled, tossing the broken remnants of the military to the very man he ruined. Vorotynsky is not standing in the mud out of loyalty to a coward. He is standing there because he knows that if this river falls, the Russian bloodline will be extinguished. Beside him is Dmitry Khvorostinin, a brilliant, cold-blooded tactician and cavalry commander. Together they take a grim inventory of their forces. The ledger is a death sentence. They have scraped together roughly 25,000 men. Do not picture a shining, disciplined military machine. This is a desperate patchwork quilt of survival. They have a corps of streltsy, the traditional Russian musketeers carrying heavy matchlocks and massive crescent-shaped battle axes called bardiches, which they use to prop up their guns. They have a vicious contingent of Don Cossacks, wild frontiersmen who fight with the savagery of starving dogs. They have a handful of German mercenaries who are quickly realizing there is not enough silver in the world to justify this contract, and the rest are terrified peasant conscripts clutching rusted spears, staring at the southern horizon with hollow eyes. The mathematics of the battlefield are brutal and unforgiving. 25,000 Russians against 120,000 Crimean Tatars and Ottoman Janissaries. They are outnumbered nearly 5-1. Every single soldier shivering in the river mist knows the horrifying truth of their reality. There is no cavalry charging over the hill to save them. There is no strategic fallback point. They are the final, fragile plug in the dam. Imagine the crushing psychological weight of the night before the attack. You are a conscript sitting in the wet grass. You look across the expanse of the river valley, and as the sun sets you see the enemy campfires igniting one by one. But they do not stop. The fires spread across the horizon until it looks like an entire galaxy of stars has fallen to the earth. The sheer scale of the horde defies human comprehension. You cannot sleep. The silence of the dark is suffocating because you can hear the distant, terrifying hum of 100,000 voices and the restless stamping of endless horses. You are not fighting for a glorious empire. You are fighting simply to breathe for one more day. Vorotynsky and Khvorostinin are under no illusions. They know they cannot win a conventional engagement. If they attempt to line these exhausted men up on an open plain, the Crimean cavalry will encircle them and butcher every last soul in less than an hour. The steppe riders are too fast, the Ottoman guns are too heavy, and the Russian morale is too brittle. They need a miracle to survive. But in the unforgiving landscape of dark history, miracles are not delivered by divine intervention. They are constructed out of wood, iron, and a willingness to execute a strategy bordering on absolute madness. As dawn breaks, the earth begins to vibrate beneath their boots. The horizon sharpens into a wall of moving steel. The horde has reached the Oka River. How do you fight a tidal wave of flesh and steel? You do not try to outrun it. You do not try to outmaneuver it. You build a breakwater, and you pray the wood does not splinter. Prince Vorotynsky and Dmitry Khvorostinin know that honor is a luxury reserved for men who are not outnumbered 5-1. If they march their 25,000 exhausted troops onto an open field to fight fairly, the Crimean cavalry will encircle them, pepper them with 1,000,000 armor-piercing arrows, and ride down the survivors in less than an hour. The Russians cannot beat the speed of the steppe, so they decide to kill the speed entirely. They introduce the Khan to a piece of terrifying military engineering known as the gulyay gorod. Translated directly, it means the wandering city. But do not let the poetic name fool you. And this is not a city. It is a medieval tank, a mobile slaughterhouse designed to completely break the physics of cavalry warfare. Imagine massive oak shields thick enough to stop a high-velocity musket ball mounted on heavy wooden wheels and sled runners. These are not individual riot shields. They are prefabricated sections of a fortress wall, dragged across the dirt by horses and pushed by desperate men. Once moved into position, these massive wooden slabs are locked together with thick iron chains, forming a continuous, unbroken ring of timber. It is a portable castle. Inside this wooden perimeter, the Russians pack every single ounce of gunpowder they possess. The streltsy, the core of the Russian infantry, line up behind the oak walls. They do not have to worry about being trampled by horses anymore. They slide the heavy barrels of their matchlocks through pre-cut murder holes. The artillerymen drag their field cannons into position, locking the wheels into the mud, aiming the muzzles through gaps in the wood. The wandering city transforms an open field into a claustrophobic trench warfare nightmare. It strips the Tatar horde of their greatest weapon, their mobility, and forces them to fight a siege battle in the middle of nowhere. But building the gulyay gorod is only half the problem. A fortress is completely useless if the enemy simply chooses to ride around it. The Crimean Khan is not stupid. He has 120,000 men. If he sees a wooden box bristling with cannons, he will just bypass it, cross the river and continue his march to burn whatever is left of Moscow. For the wandering city to work, it cannot just be a shield. It has to be a trap. Vorotynsky orders the massive wooden structure to be hauled to a strategic bottleneck near the tiny village of Molodi. He uses the rolling hills, the natural dips in the earth, and the dense tree lines to camouflage the true size of his mobile fortress. He essentially digs a massive, heavily armed pitfall trap right in the middle of the Russian heartland. If you are a Russian conscript, you are ordered inside the wooden walls, and the iron chains are locked behind you. There is no retreat. You are standing shoulder to shoulder with thousands of terrified men in a space so tight you can barely swing an axe. The air inside the gulyay gorod is thick with the smell of sweat, wet earth, and sulfur. You are staring through a narrow slit in the oak, listening to the distant, thunderous roar of 100,000 horses. You know that this wooden wall is the only thing standing between your soft flesh and the most devastating cavalry charge in human history. If the chains hold, you get to massacre the enemy at point-blank range. If the wood shatters under the weight of the charge, or if the Ottoman janissaries bring their heavy guns to bear, this wooden box will instantly become your mass coffin. Everything is set, the gunpowder is dry, the matches are lit, the trap is perfectly laid, but a trap needs bait. Someone has to walk out into the open, look the 120,000 strong horde in the face, and drag them kicking and screaming into the kill zone. And for that suicide mission, Khvorostinin mounts his horse. Dmitry Khvorostinin is not a man who believes in a fair fight. He understands the psychology of the steppe rider better than anyone else in the Russian high command. The Tatar horde, 120,000 strong, has already crossed the Oka River. They are stretching out in a massive, unstoppable column, heading straight for the charred remains of Moscow, leaving the dug-in Russian army in their dust. To get their attention, you cannot just wave a flag or blow a horn. You have to draw blood, and you have to do it in the most humiliating way possible. Khvorostinin takes a fraction of his cavalry, a meager detachment of a few thousand riders, and stares at the rear guard of an army so large it takes days to pass a single point. This is the equivalent of a man walking up to a sleeping bear and kicking it directly in the teeth. The Russian vanguard does not hesitate. They slam into the back of the Crimean column with blistering speed. It is a shock cavalry charge designed purely for maximum disrespect and immediate carnage. They are not trying to win a battle. They are trying to start a riot. Russian lances tear through the rear ranks of the Tatar baggage train, slaughtering stragglers and supply guards. The violence is sudden, intimate, and deeply confusing to the Crimean forces. For a moment, the Tatars are paralyzed not by fear, but by sheer bewilderment. Who in their right mind would attack the rear of 120,000 invincible conquerors? The confusion quickly curdles into white-hot, uncontrollable rage. Devlet Giray, the Khan who has already sold Russian cities in his mind, gets the report that a pathetic handful of Russian survivors are harassing his tail. This is not just a military annoyance, it is a profound insult to his absolute authority. In the brutal hierarchy of 16th century warfare, if you allow a lesser enemy to nip at your heels without annihilating them, you look weak to your own men. And on the steppe, weakness is a death sentence. The Khan snaps. He halts the entire march toward Moscow. He orders his elite cavalry commanders to turn the vanguard around. He does not just want the Russians repelled, he wants them ground into the dirt until their bones are indistinguishable from the ash. This is exactly what Khvorostinin is counting on. The moment he sees the massive wall of Tatar heavy cavalry wheeling around, thousands of horsemen drawing their sabers and knocking their arrows, he pulls the ripcord. He orders his men to turn and run, but this isn't a panicked rout. This is the most dangerous psychological maneuver in medieval warfare, the feigned retreat. You have to run fast enough to survive, but slow enough to keep the enemy convinced they are just seconds away from running you down. If you ride too fast, the enemy gets bored and gives up the chase. If you ride too slow, your spine is physically shredded by a storm of armor-piercing arrows. Khvorostinin dances on this razor's edge, dragging the enraged Tatar swarm backward, step by bloody step, right toward the village of Molodi. The Crimean horsemen smell blood in the water. They whip their mounts into a frenzy, completely abandoning their disciplined marching formation. The vanguard of the horde dissolves into a chaotic, screaming drag race to see who gets the glory of beheading the insolent Russian commander. They are riding so fast, their eyes fixed so intensely on the fleeing backs of their prey, that they completely ignore the landscape. They do not notice the rolling hills. They do not notice the deliberate narrowing of the valley, and they absolutely do not notice the massive, camouflaged wall of heavy oak hiding in the tall grass just over the ridge. Khvorostinin's surviving riders crest the hill, their horses foaming at the mouth, their lungs burning from the sprint. They gallop past the hidden edges of the gulyay gorod and immediately dive out of the way, clearing the firing lanes. The Tatar cavalry, numbering in the tens of thousands, crests the hill right behind them, riding at full tilt, expecting to ride down a broken enemy. Instead, they look down the barrels of hundreds of heavy matchlock muskets and field cannons already smoking with lit fuses. The fastest cavalry on earth has just sprinted headfirst into a wooden meat grinder, and the trap is sprung. Imagine being a rider in the absolute front rank of the Tatar vanguard. You crest that final hill at a full gallop, your blood singing with the anticipation of running down the fleeing Russians. Suddenly, the terrain dips, and instead of an open valley, you are staring at a solid, unbroken wall of heavy oak shields bristling with iron barrels. You violently pull back on the reins. Your horse rears up, desperately trying to stop. But it does not matter. The physics of the situation have already condemned you to death. There are tens of thousands of horsemen riding at full speed directly behind you, completely blind to the trap. Their collective momentum slams into your back, physically pushing you and your horse forward until you are pressed flat against the wooden walls of the wandering city. And then the Russian line erupts. The Streltsy do not have to aim. At this range, missing is mathematically impossible. Thousands of heavy matchlock muskets fire simultaneously. A split second later, the field cannons detonate, unleashing a storm of grape shot and jagged iron directly into the tightly packed mass of cavalry. The sound alone is enough to rupture eardrums, but the physical devastation is apocalyptic. Heavy lead balls do not just kill the first man they hit. They tear through 3, 4, 5 riders at a time, shattering armor, obliterating horse muscle, and turning the front lines of the Crimean horde into a fine red mist. The immediate aftermath is not a battle. It is a multi-horse pile-up of catastrophic proportions. The charge is moving too fast to hit the brakes. Wave after wave of Tatar cavalry crests the ridge and violently crashes into the bleeding, thrashing pile of their own dying comrades. The bodies of men and horses begin to stack up so high that they form a literal ramp of flesh against the oak walls. For the steppe riders, their greatest advantage, their terrifying speed, has been brilliantly weaponized against them. They are dying because they are too fast to stop. Inside the gulyay gorod, the psychological experience is a claustrophobic nightmare. You are a Russian conscript, your face blackened by gunpowder smoke, your shoulders bruised black and blue from the violent recoil of your musket. You cannot see the sun. The air is so thick with sulfur that every breath burns your lungs. You load, you fire, and you pray the wood holds. The entire wooden fortress is shuddering. You can feel the massive, rhythmic thuds of thousands of horses slamming against the exterior. You hear the axes of surviving Tatars desperately hacking at the oak. The Streltsy drop their empty muskets, grab their heavy crescent-shaped battle axes, and chop indiscriminately at the hundreds of desperate, bloody hands reaching through the firing slits. If a single chain snaps, if a single wall panel falls, the ocean of screaming warriors outside will pour through the breach and butcher everyone inside in minutes. When the news of the slaughter reaches Devlet Giray, the Khan does not order a tactical retreat. His arrogance simply will not allow it. He has already mentally divided up the Russian Empire. He cannot fathom being stopped by a wooden box in the middle of a muddy field. Enraged, he doubles down. He abandons all tactical sense and orders wave after relentless wave of his cavalry to charge the fortress. He is throwing human lives at a wall of gunpowder, desperately hoping that the Russians will simply run out of bullets before he runs out of men. But as the hours bleed away and the fields of Molodi become carpeted with thousands of dead horses, the Khan realizes that light cavalry cannot break heavy timber. The sun begins to set, casting long, terrifying shadows over the battlefield, and he changes his strategy. He orders his surviving horsemen to pull back and signals the ultimate nightmare for the Russian defenders. The elite Ottoman janissaries are brought to the front. They do not charge wildly, they dismount. They lock their heavy shields together, raise their own advanced muskets, and begin a slow, methodical march over the mountain of corpses. They are coming to dismantle the wandering city by hand. The quick, violent ambush has just evolved into a grueling, suffocating siege, and the 25,000 Russians are now entirely surrounded by 100,000 furious men with no way out. The adrenaline of the initial ambush evaporates, leaving behind a grueling, suffocating reality. The Battle of Molodi is no longer a brilliant tactical maneuver. It has devolved into a meat grinder. It is August, and the Russian summer heat is unforgiving. The wandering city is completely surrounded, a wooden island drowning in an ocean of hostile steel. And as the days drag on, the battlefield begins to rot. Imagine the atmosphere inside the gulyay gorod. You are trapped in a claustrophobic wooden box, with 25,000 desperate men. You cannot leave to bury the dead. You cannot leave to fetch water. The sun beats down on the open fortress, baking the earth and accelerating the decomposition of the tens of thousands of slaughtered Tatar horses and soldiers piled up just inches outside the oak walls. The stench is a physical weight that coats your throat and makes you gag with every breath. Clouds of black flies swarm the firing slits, attracted by the rivers of blood soaking into the mud. But the smell is nothing compared to the thirst. The Russians are entirely cut off from the Oka River. Water rations run dry almost immediately. Men are forced to drink the stagnant, muddy puddles that collect inside the fortress. Or worse, they resort to drinking horse blood just to keep their throats from closing up. You are fighting in a suffocating haze of sulfur and dehydration, your muscles cramping, your hands blistered from gripping your weapon. Every single time a man falls dead from exhaustion or a stray Ottoman bullet, you do not have the space to move his body. You simply step on him to keep your footing. Outside the walls, the nature of the attack has changed. Devlet Giray has realized that horses cannot chew through solid oak. He has pulled back his exhausted steppe riders and unleashed his heavy hitters. The elite Ottoman janissaries advance. They do not ride, they march. And the sound of their heavy boots squelching over the carpet of rotting corpses is a psychological weapon all its own. They bring their heavy siege guns, but the terrain and the constant Russian counterfire prevent them from setting up a clean bombardment. So they resort to the most brutal, primitive form of warfare imaginable. They are ordered to dismantle the Russian fortress by hand. The janissaries slam into the wooden walls. This is no longer a battle of maneuverability. It is a horrific, intimate street fight with a wall in the middle. The Ottomans are swinging heavy iron axes, desperately hacking at the thick oak shields and the iron chains binding them together. The wood splinters and groans under the relentless assault. Inside, the Russians are running dangerously low on gunpowder. The deafening roar of the Streltsy muskets begins to thin out, replaced by the sickening sounds of hand-to-hand trench warfare. When the powder runs out, you drop your gun, you grab your spear, your dagger, or your heavy crescent battle axe, and you wait by the narrow gaps in the wood. When an Ottoman soldier shoves his face against the slit to look inside, you blind him with a thrust. When a hand reaches through to grab the iron chains, you sever it at the wrist. It is a blind, bloody stabbing match through the cracks of a crumbling wooden shield. You are covered in the blood of men you cannot even fully see. The Khan watches this agonizing war of attrition from a safe distance, his arrogance slowly curdling into desperate rage. He has lost tens of thousands of his best men to a pile of logs in the dirt. His invincible army is bleeding out. Logically, he should pack up and leave. He still has enough men to bypass the fortress and burn Moscow. But his pride has become his prison. In the brutal politics of the steppe, if Devlet Giray walks away from a lesser force, he will look weak. And a weak Khan is a dead Khan. So he doubles down, ordering every single man from his elite guard to his civilian merchants to prepare for one final, all-out assault to crush the wooden box once and for all. Inside the crumbling, wandering city, Prince Vorotynsky looks at his starving, dying men. The chains are snapping, the wood is breaking, the ammunition is gone. They cannot survive another dawn. If they stay inside the box, they die. They need a miracle, and Vorotynsky realizes that if God is not going to send one, he will have to forge it himself in the dark. The wandering city is dying. It is the final grueling phase of the siege, and the wooden fortress has been reduced to a splintered, groaning coffin. The thick iron chains that hold the massive oak shields together are snapping one by one under the sheer, relentless pressure of 100,000 bodies pressing against them. Inside the perimeter, the Russian defenders are entirely out of gunpowder, they are out of water, they are fighting with shattered spears, rusted axes, and their bare hands. When an Ottoman janissary breaches a gap in the weakened wood, he is not shot. He is dragged inside by the desperate mob and beaten to death with the heavy wooden stocks of empty muskets. The ground beneath their boots is a slick, foul-smelling swamp of mud, human waste, and rotting blood. Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky looks at this nightmare and does the cold, mathematical calculus of survival. If they stay inside this box for one more night, they will all be butchered. The defense led by Dmitry Khvorostinin is nothing short of legendary, but pure courage cannot patch a broken wall forever. Vorotynsky knows that the Crimean Khan, Devlet Giray, has committed his entire massive force to the frontal assault. The Khan is so obsessed with crushing the arrogant Russians that he has developed fatal tunnel vision. The Tatar and Ottoman troops are packed incredibly tight around the fortress, a massive, chaotic mob of violence singularly focused on breaking the timber. This absolute obsession is the only weapon Vorotynsky has left. He devises a plan that borders on the impossible. He is going to leave the box, while Khvorostinin and the surviving infantry remain inside the perimeter to hold the line and absorb the horrific punishment. Vorotynsky quietly gathers a detachment of his best remaining cavalry. He waits for the sun to dip and for the thick, suffocating clouds of black gunpowder smoke to settle low over the battlefield. Under the cover of this artificial fog, they slowly, silently pry open the rear gates of the fortress. What follows is one of the most nerve-wracking stealth operations in medieval military history. Vorotynsky and his men do not ride their horses, they lead them by the reins. They wrap the horses' hooves in torn rags and blood-soaked clothing taken from the dead to muffle the sound of their steps. They bind their own armor tightly with thick leather straps to prevent a single piece of iron from clinking together. Every man knows the absolute stakes of this moment. If one horse panics and whinnies, if one soldier drops a heavy sword into the mud, the noise will alert the Tatar rear guard. They will be surrounded in the open and slaughtered in minutes, and the fortress will immediately fall. They slip out the back of the encampment and descend into a deep, natural ravine that cuts through the landscape. This geographical hollow acts as a hidden trench, masking them from the sightlines of the massive army above. You are wading through this ditch in the dark. The thick mud violently pulls at your boots. The air in the ravine is damp and freezing, a stark, shocking contrast to the roasting, suffocating heat of the fortress you just left. Above you, just over the grassy ridge, you can hear the deafening roar of the battle. You can hear the rhythmic thud of heavy axes hitting oak, the agonized screams of dying men, and the terrifying war cries of the elite janissaries. It sounds like the end of the world is happening right over your head, but down in the dirt, you are forced to remain absolutely silent. You hold your breath until your lungs burn. You swallow the desperate urge to cough. You soothe your terrified horse. You inch forward step by agonizing step, moving entirely parallel to an enemy force that outnumbers you 50-1. For hours, this phantom detachment creeps through the muddy ravine, perfectly navigating the blind spot of the Khan's colossal war machine. Vorotynsky is using the intimate geography of his own homeland as a shield. Finally, the terrain begins to slope upward. The deafening noise of the siege is no longer beside them. It is directly in front of them. They slowly crest the edge of the hollow and look out through the gloom. Vorotynsky has done it. He has successfully navigated his surviving cavalry entirely around the battle lines without raising a single alarm. He is now sitting directly behind the exhausted, completely exposed rear of the 120,000-strong Crimean horde. The trap is perfectly set. All he needs now is the signal to drop the hammer. The morning sun rises over Molodi, illuminating a scene of absolute grinding exhaustion. The Tatar horde and the Ottoman janissaries are pressing against the splintered remains of the wandering city like a suffocating blanket of flesh and steel. They are mere moments away from snapping the final iron chains and pouring into the perimeter. Devlet Giray, watching from his command tent, can practically taste the ashes of Moscow. He does not realize that his invincible army has just been lured into the jaws of a massive geographic vice. Inside the shattered wooden fortress, Dmitry Khvorostinin is not preparing to die. He has been waiting for a specific, predetermined moment. When the sun hits the exact right angle, he gives a quiet, terrifying command. The Streltsy drop their axes and load the absolute last scraps of hidden gunpowder, powder they have been secretly hoarding for 3 days, into their remaining cannons. They do not aim at the enemy. They point the barrels directly at the splintered wooden gates of their own fortress. Khvorostinin fires. The deafening blast blows the heavy oak doors outward, sending a shockwave of jagged splinters, iron chains, and grape shot point-blank into the tightly packed Ottoman vanguard. But the Russians do not wait for the smoke to clear. With a desperate guttural roar, the surviving defenders pour out of the smoking breach. They swing their heavy crescent axes and rusted spears, hacking wildly into the stunned, bleeding front lines of the enemy. But the true nightmare is happening a mile away, at the absolute rear of the horde. A fraction of a second after the cannons detonate in the front, Prince Vorotynsky drops the hammer. His hidden cavalry erupts from the ravine like a coiled spring of iron and muscle. The Tatar rearguard, completely focused on the siege ahead of them, does not even have time to turn their horses around. Vorotynsky's heavy lances tear through the unarmored backs of the Crimean camp followers, the merchants who came to buy Russian slaves, and the reserve cavalry. This is the exact moment the physics of the battlefield turn completely lethal. You have over 100,000 men packed tightly together in a muddy valley. The front line is suddenly being violently pushed backward by Khvorostinin's suicidal infantry charge. The back line is simultaneously being shredded and pushed forward by Vorotynsky's heavy cavalry. The middle of the army has absolutely nowhere to go. The result is a horrific, fatal compression. Men and horses are crushed to death by the sheer, panicking weight of their own comrades. The absolute worst thing that can happen to a massive, undisciplined army is a sudden, unexplainable psychological break. When the invincible steppe riders realize they are being slaughtered from behind, the illusion of their supremacy shatters into a million pieces. The chain of command evaporates in a heartbeat. 100,000 men drop their weapons, stop fighting, and start running. But they are running on foot, in the mud, directly toward the Oka River. The retreat instantly devolves into a historic, unmitigated massacre. The Russians, starved, dehydrated, and running on pure, unadulterated hatred, hunt them down like animals. The pursuit is merciless. The elite Ottoman janissaries, weighed down by their heavy armor and large muskets, are easily overtaken and cut down in the tall grass. The Tatar cavalry, separated from their precious horses in the crushing chaos, are run through from behind. When the fleeing horde finally reaches the steep banks of the Oka, they find no salvation. Desperate to escape the bloody Russian blades swinging at their backs, tens of thousands of men throw themselves into the deep, fast-moving water. Most of them are exhausted and cannot swim. They panic, grabbing onto each other, dragging their own brothers under the surface in a frantic struggle for air. The river literally chokes on the dead. The water turns a thick, frothy red, and the bodies stack up along the muddy banks like discarded driftwood. Devlet Giray, the arrogant Khan who had drawn up maps to divide a conquered empire just days before, barely escapes with his life. He abandons his elite guard, his lavish tents, and his pride, riding frantically south with a terrified fraction of his men. Out of the world-ending horde of 120,000 warriors that cross the river, barely 20,000 make it back to the Crimean Peninsula. The most terrifying war machine on the planet has just been completely, permanently annihilated by 25,000 starving men in a wooden box. The silence that falls over the Oka River in the days following the battle is heavier than the smoke. The water continues to wash the blood, and the bloated corpses of the Tatar vanguard downstream, a grotesque warning to anyone who might try to cross again. Devlet Giray, the Khan who promised to extinguish the Russian bloodline, limps back into the Crimean Peninsula with a fractured, traumatized fraction of his once invincible horde. He does not return as a conqueror. He returns as a broken old man who just lost the future of his empire in a muddy ditch. The Battle of Molodi is not just a tactical victory, it is the permanent severing of an ancient terror. For centuries, the Mongol and Tatar horsemen dictated the survival of the Russian people. After Molodi, the dynamic flips forever. The steppe riders will never again threaten the existence of the Russian state. Instead, the exhausted, bleeding nation of Russia realizes it can fight back. This single, impossible stand in the dirt paves the way for the Russian Tsardom to look east, eventually swallowing the vast expanse of Siberia and forging one of the largest empires in human history. You would expect the architect of this miraculous salvation to be given the world. You would expect Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky to ride into Moscow on a white horse, showered in silver, granted vast estates, and immortalized as the absolute savior of the motherland. But you must remember the era we are exploring. This is the 16th century. This is dark history. And in the dark, heroes are rarely rewarded. When the smoke clears and the threat of total annihilation is completely gone, Tsar Ivan the Terrible finally creeps out of hiding. The man who abandoned his people to the fire, who packed his treasury and ran while 25,000 starving men held the line, returns to his ruined capital. As he rides through the streets, he hears the whispers of his surviving subjects. They are not praising the Tsar, they are praising Vorotynsky. And in the twisted, profoundly paranoid mind of Ivan the Terrible, popularity is indistinguishable from treason. Ivan does not look at the scarred, exhausted general and see a loyal servant. He sees a man who knows how to kill an empire. He sees a threat. Less than a year after the dirt at Molodi soaked up the blood of 100,000 enemies, Vorotynsky is arrested. A rogue servant, entirely fabricated and coerced by the Tsar's secret police, accuses the great general of witchcraft and plotting to assassinate the Tsar. There is no trial, there is no defense. The savior of Russia is dragged into the dungeons. The brutality of his end is difficult to stomach. Vorotynsky is stripped, beaten, and tied securely to a heavy wooden post. A slow burning fire is lit directly beneath his feet. The chronicles of the time tell us a detail that is chilling in its cruelty. Ivan the Terrible does not just order the execution, he attends it. As the flames begin to lick at the prince's flesh, the Tsar of Russia stands over the dying man, personally using his heavy wooden walking staff to rake the burning coals closer to Vorotynsky's body, ensuring the agony is drawn out for as long as humanly possible. The man who built the wooden fortress to save the Russian Empire is burned alive on a wooden pyre by the very empire he protected. He dies in excruciating agony, his lands confiscated, his name dragged through the mud. History is not a fairy tale where good triumphs over evil and bravery guarantees a happy ending. It is a brutal, unforgiving meat grinder. The The Battle of Molodi proves that human willpower can break the impossible, but the fate of its hero reminds us that the most dangerous monsters are rarely the ones marching across the border. Often, they are the ones sitting on the throne behind you. If you made it this far, you are a true history enthusiast. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. Check out this next video on the screen to dive deeper into the terrifying and bloody reign of Ivan the Terrible. And I have a question for you. Do you think Prince Vorotynsky knew he was signing his own death warrant by winning the battle and becoming a legend? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is not just about the past. It is a warning for the future.